The lawyer's office was quiet enough that I could hear the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. I sat still at the end of the table, my back straight, my hands resting in my lap. My daughter, in-law Charlotte, sat across from me, her posture sharp as if she owned the room. Her hair was polished, her lipstick flawless, her smile controlled, but her eyes gave her away. They burned with a hunger that made my skin prickle, as if she could already taste the fortune she believed belonged to her. She tilted her chin ever so slightly, a gesture of triumph not yet earned. Beside her was my son Mark, his shoulders hunched as though carrying a weight no one could see. His eyes flicked nervously toward his wife, searching her face before he dared to move a muscle. That glance struck me harder than any insult. Once he had looked at me that way for reassurance, for trust. Now he looked only to her. Around the table, our relatives whispered behind tight lips. I caught fragments, little murmurs that stung. They had not come to honor the dead. They had come to see how the spoils would fall and to measure my silence. At the head of the table, the lawyer adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. He looked at each of us with calm precision before lowering his eyes to the papers before him. The lawyer's voice was even, measured, as he read from the document. He spoke of assets and valuations, the words dry and technical, until one number cut through the air like a blade. $55 million. The syllables seemed to echo against the paneled walls. For a moment no one moved. I watched Charlotte first, her lips pressed tight, fighting to hide the upward curve of triumph. Her fingers dug into the leather arms of her chair, knuckles whitening, betraying the surge of joy she could not fully contain. Beside her, Mark shifted uncomfortably. His head leaned slightly toward his wife, eyes flicking in her direction. Relief and hesitation tangled in his expression, as if the figure had lifted a burden from his shoulders but placed another around his neck. His chest rose with a shallow breath, and I could almost hear his silent thought. Maybe the debts would not drown him after all. Then came the whispers, cousins leaning close, murmuring sharp little sentences. Unbelievable. All of it. Their words crawled across the table like insects, meant to sting me, meant to remind me that I was outnumbered. Each whisper added weight to the silence pressing against me, as if the entire room waited for me to collapse under it. I did not move. My hands stayed still in my lap, my face calm. Yet inside I felt the stone of humiliation lodged deep in my chest. They thought the figure announced my defeat. They believed I was stripped bare before them. Charlotte's eyes gleamed, Mark avoided mine, and the air seemed to thicken with their certainty. I sat alone in that silence, letting them believe, while the number hung between us like a verdict already passed. The meeting had barely ended when Charlotte rose with a sudden snap of movement. Chairs scraped against the floor as relatives shifted, startled, but she was already striding toward the hallway. My suitcase, the one I had carried with me, rested neatly against the wall. She did not hesitate. With a smirk tugging at her lips, she grabbed the handle, marched to the glass door, and flung it open. The sound came next, sharp and brutal. The suitcase slammed down the stone steps outside with a thud that rattled through the room. Gasps filled the air. Every face turned toward me, some wide with shock, others hiding poorly veiled satisfaction. The echo lingered as if the very walls carried the insult. Charlotte stood framed in the doorway, her posture theatrical, chin raised high. She let the silence stretch, savoring the sting, then released a laugh as brittle as glass. Her voice cut clean across the stunned hush. "Mother, you only has this suitcase now. 55 million belongs to us." Mark shifted in his chair, face pale, lips parted as if he wanted to object, but could not find the courage. His eyes slid toward me, then back to his wife, torn and helpless. The room itself seemed to close in, thick with tension, judgment, and whispers barely contained. I sat motionless, my fingers curled inward, pressing into my palm. The humiliation scorched my chest, yet I forced my face to remain smooth, untouched, as if I had not been stripped bare in front of them all. Their eyes bored into me, waiting for collapse. I would not give them that. Not Charlotte, not anyone. I lifted my chin slightly, steadying the storm within, and let the silence swallow her laughter. I did not move when the suitcase hit the ground. My hands tightened inside my gloves, the leather creaking faintly as if it could bear the pressure I refused to release. My face betrayed nothing. No protest, no cry, only stillness. Yet my eyes followed every flicker of Charlotte's smile, every cruel angle of her posture, as if I were engraving them into stone. Humiliation burned through me, hot and sharp, but beneath the sting another flame rose. Pain had always been familiar, but this was different. This was a call to remember who I was before grief hollowed me out. I was not only a widow in black. I was the woman who built fortunes, who signed contracts, who survived storms. Around me, whispers hissed and eyes pressed in, hungry for a spectacle. I gave them nothing. I let the silence hold, my chin steady, my breath controlled. I let them believe I was beaten, for now. When I finally stood, my figure seemed small in that heavy room, but my gaze was not. It cut across the table, cold and certain, a promise etched in steel. The battle had only begun, and I would not fall quietly. I have lived more than 60 years, and most of them were spent fighting for every inch of ground I stand on now. People in this room see only the number, 55 million, as if it had fallen from the sky. They forget, or perhaps never cared to know, how it was earned. My late husband and I built our company from nothing, beginning with one small office, one contract that we signed with trembling hands, one chance we refused to let slip. I still remember the long nights, the rows of ledgers, the way we argued and then laughed because we had no choice but to keep going. That company grew, stone by stone, until it carried our names into respectability. The fortune did not stop with the business. We studied markets when others gambled, invested in property when the streets were still rough, bought shares when no one wanted them. Insurance, bonds, patient choices that seemed dull at the time, all of it gathered into the foundation of what my family enjoys now. I was always proud, always independent, perhaps too stern at times. I demanded discipline from my son, fairness from my employees, loyalty from those closest to me. Yet when my husband died, the house felt larger than I could bear, every hallway echoing with silence. It is strange how money multiplies but cannot fill a chair at the dinner table. Grief made me smaller, lonelier, easier to dismiss. They look at me now and see a widow in black, fragile and outdated. They do not see the woman who built an empire brick by brick. That is their mistake. My son, Mark, was 35, an age when a man should already know his place in the world, yet he still drifted like a boy waiting for someone else to chart his course. Once, I believed he would inherit not only the company, but also the discipline and grit that built it. He had the mind for numbers, the charm to win clients, and the advantage of every lesson his father and I tried to teach. But talent without backbone is a fragile thing. Pressure found his cracks. The debts grew quietly at first. A bad investment in stocks, a failed partnership, then more desperate ventures dressed up as opportunities. I lent him money, not once, not twice, but again and again. Each time he promised he would turn it around. Each time the money seemed to vanish, swallowed by Charlotte's appetite for expensive dinners, designer clothes, and trips meant to impress people who would never care for him. Now I sit and watch as he leans toward her, silent when her cruelty cuts through me in front of our family. He does not defend me, does not even look ashamed. His eyes plead with her instead, as if her approval is the air he breathes. That betrayal presses heavier than the loss of money. I would have forgiven failure. I cannot forgive indifference. I remember the nights he came to me with his hopeful eyes, asking for help to start something of his own. I wanted to believe, wanted to see him succeed where we once struggled. But the money was never for building. It was always for burning. And tonight, as he lets her cast me aside, I see the ashes of every chance I gave him dot my daughter. In law, Charlotte was 30, and the kind of beauty she carried was the polished, deliberate kind. Every detail was calculated, from the shine of her hair to the curve of her lipstick. She spoke with practiced ease, her voice smooth enough to win strangers in minutes, but I had learned long ago that her words were tools, not truths. Behind each compliment rested a hook, behind each smile a tally of what she could gain. She sat through the will reading with the air of someone already crowned. In her mind the inheritance was sealed, the empire mine and my husband's reduced to a gift-wrapped prize for her taking. I could see it in the way she held her shoulders, the triumphant tilt of her head. She believed that by the end of the day she would be mistress of every property, every account, every room where my name once carried weight. The relatives fell easily for her act. To them she was gracious, attentive, even affectionate, calling me mother with a softness that sounded genuine. But I saw what they did not. In quiet moments when she thought no one was looking, her eyes betrayed her. They flashed with disdain, sharp and fleeting, as if my presence was an inconvenience, as if my age was a failing. Those glances were knives meant only for me, reminders that she believed my time was over. They thought her charm was devotion, but I knew better. I had faced ambition before, but never one wrapped so tightly in silk and perfume. Charlotte's beauty was her weapon, her voice her armor, and her hunger the fire that drove her. She was not content with what she had. She wanted it all, and she thought she already owned it. I remember the day as if it had been painted into my memory. Charlotte sat in a glossy cafe on the corner of Fifth, the kind where porcelain cups clinked softly and waiters hovered like attendants at court. She leaned back in her chair, her red nails drumming lightly against the table, her laughter spilling too easily as she spoke to her friend. Her voice carried just enough to reach the next table, as though she wanted the world to hear her triumph before it had even arrived. A few more days, she said, and every bank debt would vanish. The credit cards she had maxed out, the mortgage that threatened to swallow their apartment, the reckless loans taken in Mark's name for ventures that never stood a chance. All of it, she promised, would dissolve like mist once the inheritance was in her hands. Her friend gasped in admiration, and Charlotte smiled with the glow of someone who believed herself untouchable. I can still see the gleam in her eyes as she lifted her cup, savoring the taste of victory she had not yet earned. She was certain the will would grant her the world, that my years of work would be reduced to the key unlocking her escape. But in that certainty lay her weakness. She had built no foundation, relied on no strength of her own. She balanced her entire future on the fall of my husband's pen. That moment in the cafe was more than arrogance. It was prophecy. She had already stepped onto the path where greed blinds and downfall waits. The silence of the lawyer's office pressed against me, but my mind refused to stay in the present. As Charlotte shifted smugly in her seat, I saw not only her but the ghosts of another time. I remembered the cramped office my husband and I once shared, the smell of ink and dust, the way our desks wobbled on uneven legs. We signed our first contract there, hands trembling, hearts determined. Every dollar that built this fortune had been wrestled from nights without sleep, from years when success was nothing more than stubborn faith. Charlotte's laughter from some distant cafe rang in my memory, her careless promise that debts would disappear once the inheritance was hers. That echo clashed with the picture of the factory floor we had walked, the workers who trusted us, the clients who shook our hands because we kept our word. I wondered how easily she believed she could erase all of that history with a single line on a will. I sat still now, appearing small, perhaps even defeated. But within me, those memories stood like pillars. They reminded me that I was not a relic to be brushed aside. I had built more than wealth. I had built respect, resilience, the kind of strength that survives betrayal. So when the whispers around the table grew louder, measuring me, judging me, I let them wonder. Could a woman who once carved a company out of nothing truly be undone by her son's wife? Or was this the first mistake Charlotte made, underestimating the woman who had already weathered storms far greater than her ambition? After the others filed out, I stayed behind, the quiet of the office wrapping around me like a shroud. I touched the stack of papers the lawyer had read aloud, and unease pricked at me. The memory rose unbidden, clear as if it had happened yesterday. Months ago, my husband had placed a draft in my hands. He wanted me to see that everything was in order, that his work and our legacy would be protected. I had not read it all that day. I remembered flipping through the first pages, smiling at his careful notes, reassuring him with a touch on his arm. Grief and fatigue had hung heavy on both of us, and I promised to look more closely later. What stayed with me was not the clauses but the detail at the bottom of the page, page 1 of 27. The number imprinted itself in my mind, as permanent as his handwriting. Tonight, the document in front of me was too thin, 12 pages only, each stamped, each signed, too neat and too final. 15 pages had simply vanished, and I had never seen their contents. A knot of suspicion tightened in my chest. What had been written in those missing pages? Why were they not here tonight? The silence pressed down, and with it came the sharp certainty that something had been hidden from me. That evening the family gathered around the dining table, the silverware glinting under warm lights. Conversation was light on the surface, filled with pleasantries, yet beneath it I felt the undercurrent of calculation. Charlotte was at her most radiant, pouring wine into Mark's glass with a smile so gracious it seemed rehearsed. She turned to me suddenly, her tone smooth, her words wrapped in false kindness. "Mother," she said, "you should think about resting in a fine senior residence. They have excellent programs, wonderful companions. We will take care of everything." The table fell silent for a beat, relatives glancing toward me as if expecting gratitude. My fork hovered above the plate, though my appetite had vanished. I recognized the suggestion for what it was, not care, but eviction. She wanted me out of the house, far from the walls where every painting and every piece of furniture still carried my husband's memory. I kept my expression composed, nodding faintly, pretending to ponder. But my eyes caught the flicker between hers and Mark's, a quick glance of agreement, a secret message carried in silence. He looked away almost instantly, his jaw tightening, his hands clenched around his napkin. I said nothing, only lowered my fork and smoothed the napkin across my lap. Let them believe I was considering it, that I was weary and ready to surrender. Inside, I memorized that glance, that alignment of betrayal. It was proof enough that their ambition no longer feared discretion. The call came the next afternoon, as I was arranging papers in my study. The voice on the line was polite, professional, but carried the hesitation of someone uncertain whether they should be speaking to me at all. "Mrs. Helena," the banker said, "we wanted to confirm an unusual request. Earlier today, a woman identifying herself as your daughter-in-law submitted documents to withdraw a substantial amount from the family trust account." I froze, the pen in my hand slipping slightly. Trust account. My breath caught. I asked him to repeat, to explain. He continued, careful with every word. "The request was denied. Only the trustee can authorize such withdrawals. No one else, not even family members, has the right." I thanked him calmly, though inside the floor seemed to tilt beneath me. My eyes fell to the neat stack of papers from the will reading, 12 pages that had felt too thin. If the assets sat inside a trust, then what had been read aloud last night was nothing more than a shell, a decoy for appearances. The banker cleared his throat and asked whether I wished to file a formal note of concern. I declined for now. My mind was already racing ahead. If the fortune was secured inside a trust, then Charlotte's triumph was nothing but smoke. Yet smoke has a way of clouding vision, and everyone in that room had been blinded, except me. Later that night I found Mark alone in the living room, the glow of his phone screen lighting his face. He looked older than his years, worn down by debts I could not see but felt in the heaviness of his shoulders. I stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping in. My voice was quiet. "Mark, are you sure everything will be all right?" He startled, his eyes darting up, then sliding quickly away. His fingers tightened around the phone as though it were a lifeline. "Charlotte has planned it all," he murmured, almost to himself. I I trust her." The words trembled in the air, brittle as glass. He did not meet my eyes. His voice carried no conviction, only the quiver of a man cornered by promises he wanted to believe. I recognized that tone, the same he had used when asking me for loans he never repaid, the same hollow certainty that had led him deeper into ruin. I wanted to shake him, to force him to see, but I only stood still. A mother's anger cannot cure blindness when a heart is already bound. He looked trapped, caught between love and desperation, leaning on Charlotte's schemes as if they were the last plank on sinking waters. I left him there, my chest heavy, my questions unanswered. He was no longer my ally. The boy I raised was gone, replaced by a man too weak to stand beside me. When the house finally grew quiet, I climbed the stairs to my room, the weight of the day pressing against my bones. Yet before I reached the door, my eyes drifted through the window to the street below. There it was, my suitcase, the one Charlotte had flung like garbage hours earlier, still lying where it had landed. No one had bothered to retrieve it. No hand had lifted it back inside. It lay there as if it no longer belonged to me. I descended slowly, step by measured step, and opened the front door. The night air was cool, brushing against my face as I bent to pick it up. Dust clung to its corners, a faint scratch marking the side from the fall. I brushed it clean with deliberate care, my fingers moving as gently as if smoothing a wound. The leather was worn but strong, like me, carrying stories too heavy for anyone else to bear. As I straightened, I held it firmly by the handle, my eyes fixed not on the suitcase but on the darkness ahead. My reflection in the glass door stared back, not broken, not beaten, but sharpened. A murmur rose from deep within, words meant only for myself. If they think this suitcase is all I have left, then they will be forced to read the last pages. The next morning I visited Margaret, an old friend who had once invested a small share in the company. She welcomed me into her garden, where roses grew in neat rows, and poured tea into delicate cups. We spoke of ordinary things at first, health, the weather, the passing of years, but as the conversation deepened, her eyes sharpened with memory. She leaned forward, lowering her voice as if the wind itself might carry her words away. "Helena," she said softly, "I remember seeing your husband at the notary's office not long before he passed. He was signing something, an amendment, I believe, Amendment number 3 to the trust. I thought little of it at the time, but I don't recall hearing it mentioned during the reading last night." The porcelain cup trembled slightly in my hand, though I forced a smile. My heart pounded against my ribs as if it wished to break free. So it was not just my imagination. There had been more. He had left a final safeguard, a set of instructions carefully placed where only honesty should have revealed them, and yet they had vanished. I thanked Margaret, disguising my shock as gratitude, but her words rang in my ears long after I left her garden. The missing pages, the denied withdrawal, and now this forgotten amendment, they were pieces of the same puzzle. Someone had buried what my husband had intended to preserve. 2 days later, as I walked into the marble lobby of the law firm, a familiar voice called my name. It was Evelyn, a junior assistant who had once worked with my husband during contract filings. She drew me aside, her expression cautious, her voice lowered to a whisper. "Helena, I think you should know something. Charlotte asked me weeks ago to send her a summary of the will by email. Only the will. She never once mentioned the trust. It seemed strange to me at the time, but now I understand." Evelyn slipped a folded sheet into my hand. The email, printed and dated, lay stark against the paper. There was Charlotte's name, her polite request, her insistence on a shortened version. Just the will, stripped of attachments, stripped of anything beyond the surface. My eyes scanned the lines, my pulse tightening. She had not forgotten the trust. She had ignored it, intentionally. I imagined her triumphant face at the reading, the way she claimed victory as if the 12 pages were scripture. Mark believed her, the family believed her, because the trust had been buried under silence. And now here was proof, black and white, that she had engineered the illusion herself. I folded the sheet carefully, tucking it into my purse as though it were a weapon. Charlotte was not merely greedy, she was deliberate, and she had underestimated me. I went to the bank myself, unwilling to rely on whispers and fragments any longer. The lobby smelled faintly of polished brass and ink, the marble floor gleaming under the morning sun. A manager I had known for years greeted me with a respectful nod, then led me to his office. Behind closed doors, he pulled a thick folder from the cabinet and set it gently on the desk. "Mrs. Helena," he said, "here are the documents you requested." My hands did not tremble as I opened the folder, though my pulse thundered in my ears. Page after page, the truth revealed itself. The primary accounts, transferred into the trust years ago. The stock portfolio, held securely within the same structure. The real estate, the buildings my husband and I had purchased brick by brick, also bound to the trust. Only a scattering of minor assets remained outside, items of little consequence, funneled into the will for appearance's sake. Jewelry, a vehicle, a few accounts with balances too small to matter. That was all Charlotte had paraded in front of the family, waving those 12 pages like a crown. I closed the folder slowly, a cold clarity settling over me. The will was not the treasure she believed it to be. It was a husk, a shell designed to sit neatly above the true foundation. My husband had locked the real fortune away long before his final days. I thanked the manager, my voice steady. As I walked out of the bank into the brisk air, I carried more than papers. I carried certainty. Charlotte's triumph was an illusion, and illusions break easily once light shines through. One evening, as shadows stretched across the house, I heard the faint echo of Charlotte's voice carrying down the hallway. Mark stood outside their bedroom door, frozen, listening. She was on the phone, her tone careless, triumphant. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh meant to slice. "That old woman knows nothing of the law," she said. "Last page or not, I already hold everything." I saw Mark's shoulders stiffen, his hand lifting halfway toward the doorframe. For a moment, he looked as though he might burst in, demand answers, confront the truth. His face betrayed confusion, the flicker of doubt that perhaps he had been led astray. But the door opened, and Charlotte's voice shifted instantly. She cooed, sweet as honey, wrapping her arms around him. "Don't worry," she whispered. "Once the dust settles, we'll be free. All those debts, all that weight, gone. We'll live like royalty, you and I." Her hand traced his arm, her eyes soft with promise. Mark exhaled shakily, the fight draining from him. The lines in his face eased, not from conviction but from surrender. He wanted to believe her more than he wanted to face the truth. I watched him nod, slow and weak, clinging to her fantasy as if it were salvation. In that instant, I understood. My son would not stand at my side. Fear and weakness had bound him to her. Whatever storm was coming, I would face it alone. That night the house was silent, the kind of silence that pressed against the walls and carried the weight of memory. I lit a single lamp in the parlor, its glow falling over the framed portrait of my husband. His eyes, captured years ago, looked out with the same calm certainty that had guided me through every storm. I stepped closer, my hand brushing the wooden frame, and let the words rise from the place where grief and resolve met. "You left me a path," I whispered. "They think I am blind, but it is they who walk straight into the trap." The air felt different after I spoke, sharper, as if the room itself had shifted. For weeks I had carried humiliation like a stone in my chest, but now it cracked open, releasing something colder, clearer. The missing pages, the trust documents, the amendment Margaret remembered, the email Charlotte had buried, each piece was no longer confusion but part of a pattern. My husband had known what was coming. He had built the safeguards. All I needed was to uncover them at the right moment. I chose a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street, the kind where no one asked questions and the hiss of the espresso machine covered whispers. Harris was already waiting, his gray suit slightly rumpled, his briefcase set neatly at his side. When I sat down, he leaned forward with the ease of an old ally. "Helena," he said, "I've reviewed everything. The will is little more than formality. The trust," he tapped the briefcase, "is the true heart of the estate." He slid a thin envelope across the table. Inside lay a set of scans, 27 pages in total. Each one bore my husband's initials, each sealed with a notary's stamp. I turned the pages slowly, my breath steady, my chest tightening with every confirmation. There was no doubt, the missing amendment was real, the structure intact. My husband had made certain of it. Harris lowered his voice. "If you wish, all you need to do is reveal the last page. It would be enough to silence them." I closed the folder carefully, my fingertips lingering on the crisp paper. "Not yet," I said, a faint smile tugging at my lips. Let them grow confident. Let them believe they have already won. When the trap closes, it will not be me who falls." Harris studied me for a moment, then nodded, as though he understood the steel behind my calm. I folded the envelope back into my bag, rising with the weight of both memory and purpose. For the first time in weeks, I felt the tide turning. One by one, the pieces began to fall into my hands, each colder and sharper than the last. The first was the scanned trust, 27 pages intact, every footer marked page X of 27, every sheet initialed by my husband, sealed by the notary's stamp. Amendment number 3 sat firmly in the middle, dated 6 months before his passing, a safeguard he had tucked away like a final shield. Then came the papers from the bank. The clerk had shown me the rejected withdrawal request, Charlotte's bold attempt to take what was never hers. The form bore my name, scrawled in an imitation that tried to mimic my hand but failed in every stroke. Worse for her, the bank system had captured her image at the counter, frozen forever in the glow of the security camera. The third piece was the email, printed on plain white paper. Charlotte's polite wording could not hide the calculation behind it. She had asked for only the will, never the trust, determined to shape her story from what suited her, discarding what bound the estate beyond her reach. And then, the recording. On my phone, a clipped conversation replayed. Charlotte's voice low, sharp, cutting into Mark. "If your mother keeps standing in our way, I'll have her in a nursing home." The threat hung in the air, cruel and naked. I gathered the folder shut, the weight of it heavy in my lap. It was no longer suspicion, but certainty. Each page, each file, each word was a weapon, and when the time came, I would place them all on the table. The papers lay scattered across my desk, their edges crisp beneath my fingertips. As I stacked them into order, the past rose before me, vivid and unyielding. I saw myself decades younger, seated beside my husband in a dim office that smelled of ink and dust. The contract before us was modest, a few pages that promised little to the world but everything to us. Our hands trembled as we signed, side by side, carving the first mark of what would become our life's work. I remember the way he looked at me afterward, his eyes alight with conviction stronger than youth. "One day," he whispered, "this legacy will protect you, even when I am no longer here." His words sank deep, not as comfort but as a vow, a covenant written into the marrow of our journey together. That memory pressed against the present, binding the ink of those early pages to the evidence now gathered before me. He had prepared for this moment. He had trusted me not only to endure but to defend. I was not the widow they mocked, not a fragile woman clutching at scraps. I was the keeper of his promise, the guardian of a fortress built with sweat and sacrifice. At the next family dinner, I placed my fork down gently and let my voice slip into the quiet hum of conversation. "Charlotte," I asked, "are you certain everything belongs to you?" I seemed to remember more pages than what was read. My tone was mild, almost uncertain, as though I were a woman plagued by fading memory. For a heartbeat, silence settled over the table. Then Charlotte laughed, a sharp sound dressed as charm. "Oh, Mother, you worry too much. You're old now. Let us handle these matters. Everything important has already been read." Her words cut with a sweetness that soured before it reached the end. Relatives chuckled nervously, some nodding in agreement, others pretending not to notice. Mark shifted in his chair, eyes darting between us, lips pressed thin but silent. Charlotte leaned back, triumphant, her glass of wine catching the light as she raised it in a mock toast. I did not reply. My head dipped in a slow nod, as though her reassurances had eased me. Yet inside, steel coiled tighter. My gaze lingered on her, not broken, not weary, but sharpened. Behind my calm expression, a promise formed. Let her laugh, let her bask in her hollow victory. The time would come when her words would choke her, when every missing page she dismissed would rise again to strike. The room was hushed, lit only by the golden glow of the lamp on my desk. Shadows clung to the corners, but the pool of light fell across a single letter, folded and worn at the edges from my hands, returning to it again and again. It was my husband's writing, firm yet gentle, the loops of his pen still carrying the steadiness that had once anchored me through storms. I traced the ink with my fingertip, as if I could touch him through the strokes. The words rose from the page, familiar but no less powerful. I trust only you to keep this legacy safe. That final line, written with such clarity, seemed to speak aloud in the silence. He had known even then that trials would come, that others would reach greedy hands toward what we had built. And he had known, too, that I would have the strength to guard it. I closed my eyes, holding the paper against my chest, feeling its weight settle not as burden, but as vow. Memories of his voice stirred within me, calm and resolute, urging me forward. My lips moved without thought, the promise spilling into the quiet air. I will not fail you. When I opened my eyes again, the shadows seemed to retreat. The letter lay before me like a map, not of roads but of duty. I placed it carefully back into its envelope and slid it beside the leather case of evidence. Together they were no longer reminders of loss, but instruments of resolve. 1 week later, the family gathered once more in the law firm's largest conference room. The long mahogany table stretched beneath the harsh glow of the ceiling lamps, its polished surface reflecting anxious faces. Relatives filled the seats, their whispers cutting short as the heavy door closed. A few old friends of the family sat in the back, their presence quiet but watchful, like witnesses summoned by fate. Charlotte entered first, her heels clicking sharp against the floor. She carried herself with the triumph of someone convinced the battle was already won. Her smile was polished, her eyes bright with arrogance. Mark followed close behind, shoulders tense, fingers twitching at his cufflinks. His gaze shifted restlessly between his wife and the floor, as though afraid to meet anyone else's eyes. I arrived last, my steps measured, the leather case steady in my hand. I placed it carefully beside my chair, letting its presence settle over the room like a silent promise. My face betrayed no emotion, but inside my resolve burned steady. At the head of the table, Mr. Grant, the senior lawyer, adjusted his spectacles and tapped the folder before him. His voice broke the silence with calm authority. "Today we are gathered once again," he said, "to clarify certain points of dispute regarding the will and the estate." The air thickened at his words. All eyes flicked toward the papers, toward me, toward Charlotte's expectant smirk. They believed this would be a rehearsal of victory. Only I knew it was the prologue to revelation. Charlotte's laugh rang sharp against the heavy air, a sound meant to slice through doubt. "I think everything is already clear," she said, her chin tilting in triumph. "The entire 55 million belongs to us." Her words hung in the room like a verdict. A few relatives nodded hesitantly, as if eager to agree with whoever appeared strongest. I did not move. My hands rested calmly in my lap, my gaze steady but silent. The quiet unsettled them more than anger would have. Across the table, Mr. Grant cleared his throat and lifted a thick folder, its weight echoing as he placed it firmly on the wood. He looked slowly around the table, his glasses catching the light. "Tell me," he asked evenly, "has anyone here actually read all 27 pages of this document?" The room fell into stillness, broken only by the faint hum of the lights. A cough from the back, the shuffle of a chair, then silence again. No one answered. Charlotte's painted smile faltered for the first time. Her brows drew tight, her lips parting in irritation. "What do you mean?" she snapped. "I read it." Grant's eyes fixed on her, calm but impenetrable. "Did you?" he asked. His voice was not loud, yet it filled every corner of the room. My heartbeat remained steady as I watched her shift uncomfortably. The case beside me felt heavy with the truth waiting to be released. Mr. Grant's fingers moved with unhurried precision as he turned through the thick folder. Page after page whispered beneath his hand until he stopped at one near the end. His voice was calm, but the weight of each word struck like iron. On page 24 he read, "There is a clause stating that Mark and Charlotte are to receive $10,000 each, but only on the condition that they do not contest the trust. Should they contest it, they forfeit everything." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. A murmur rippled across the table, relatives leaning toward one another with wide eyes. Some gasped, others whispered in disbelief. The certainty that had filled the room moments ago shifted into unease, as though the floor itself had tilted. Charlotte froze, her smile collapsing into something brittle. Her face drained of color, the rouge on her cheeks now harsh against pallid skin. For a heartbeat she seemed unable to speak, her lips parting soundlessly. Then her eyes darted toward Mark, searching, pleading, furious all at once. Mark sat rigid, his hands clenched on the table, knuckles white. The promise of millions had just shrunk to 10,000, and only if they stayed silent. His gaze flicked nervously around the room, landing briefly on me before falling back to the table. Charlotte swallowed, trying to compose herself, but her voice cracked when she finally spoke. This, this must be a mistake. Grant merely adjusted his glasses, his expression unchanging. The clause is notarized and binding, he replied. There is no mistake. Mr. Grant did not pause long. His steady hand turned another page, the rustle loud in the still air. This provision, he said, makes matters even clearer. It states explicitly that the spouse of any beneficiary shall have no right, direct, indirect, or future, to any interest in the trust. He let the words hang, then continued, and furthermore, the share designated for Mark is to be placed in a subtrust, with a corporate trustee appointed to manage and control it. A ripple of shock coursed through the room. Heads turned, murmurs swelled, the air heavy with disbelief. Some relatives leaned forward, eyes bright with curiosity. Others shook their heads as though the ground beneath their expectations had collapsed. Grant's voice sharpened as he closed the point. In other words, Charlotte, you will never have the right to touch the money. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, even a nervous laugh or two filled the space. All eyes locked on Charlotte, who sat frozen, her jaw tight, her face stricken. The smug assurance she had carried like armor cracked wide open. Her lips parted, but no words emerged. Her gaze flicked wildly from the lawyer to the papers to Mark, as though searching for rescue. Mark himself stared blankly at the table, color drained, his shoulders hunched under the weight of humiliation. The leather case at my side grew heavier with its secrets yet to be revealed, but I allowed myself the faintest glance toward Charlotte. For the first time, it was she who looked small. The room had barely settled from the last revelation when I leaned forward and unclasped the leather case. The click of the lock echoed like a gunshot in the silence. I drew out a folder stamped with the seal of the bank and laid it on the table. My voice was calm, each word deliberate. This is the withdrawal request Charlotte submitted last week. It bears my name, forged in her hand. The bank declined the request, and they preserved the security footage. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Mr. Grant took the papers from me, adjusted his glasses, and held them up. On one side, my authentic signature. On the other, Charlotte's crude imitation, letters uneven, strokes forced. He placed the copies side by side for all to see. The contrast was undeniable. Charlotte's face drained of color. Her mouth opened, then shut, then opened again, but no explanation came. Words tangled in her throat, stammering half-sentences that dissolved into silence. Mark turned sharply toward her, his voice cracking with disbelief. You really did this?" His hands trembled on the edge of the table, eyes wide as if seeing his wife for the first time. The whispers rose again, sharper now, edged with judgment. Relatives exchanged looks, some shaking their heads, others whispering about fraud and disgrace. Charlotte sank back into her chair, her posture collapsing, eyes darting as though searching for an exit that did not exist. For the first time, she had no performance left to give. Mr. Grant's hands moved with quiet gravity as he turned to the final page. His voice carried the weight of conclusion. According to Amendment Number 3, he read, $30 million are to be transferred into the family foundation, with Helena appointed as chairwoman. The funds are to be used exclusively for scholarships and charitable purposes. The words struck the room like a bell. Relatives leaned forward, stunned, their murmurs fading into silence. Charlotte's lips parted, Disbelief etched across her face as though the floor had vanished beneath her. Grant reached into his folder and withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges, bearing my husband's familiar handwriting. "And here," he said, "is a letter of wishes, penned by the deceased." My fingers trembled only once as I broke the seal. The paper unfolded slowly, carrying the scent of ink and time. I read aloud, my voice steady, each word cutting through the heavy air. "I do not believe Charlotte is capable of preserving this legacy. I believe in you. I entrust all authority to you so that this fortune will protect the family rather than destroy it." The room fell into utter stillness. Not even a whisper broke the weight of those words. A few relatives lowered their heads, eyes shimmering, hands lifting to dab away tears. Others stared at me, not with pity, but with recognition, acknowledging the burden I carried and the strength that had been placed in my hands. Charlotte sat frozen, her painted smile shattered beyond repair, and for the first time, the silence itself stood as judgment. Charlotte's face drained of every trace of color. Her voice cracked as she tried to rise, her hand gripping the edge of the table. "This is staged!" she shouted, her eyes darting wildly. "I will sue every one of you!" The words rang desperate, more plea than threat. Mr. Grant did not flinch. His tone remained measured, almost gentle, though every syllable carried steel. "You are free to file suit," he said, "but the no contest clause will immediately strip you of even the $10,000 allotted, and the bank may choose to forward your forged signature to the authorities for criminal investigation." The silence that followed was suffocating. Mark collapsed back into his chair, his hands clutching his head, fingers tangled in his hair. His shoulders shook as if the weight of every reckless choice had finally landed on him at once. He did not look at his wife, nor at me. He stared into the dark space of his own undoing. I remained still, spine straight, my hands folded on the table. I did not need to raise my voice. The truth had done the work for me. Around us, the relatives shifted, their gazes sharp and unforgiving. Faces once eager to flatter Charlotte now twisted with disdain. Murmurs spread quickly, harsh in their simplicity. Greed devours itself. Charlotte's breath came shallow, her composure shattered beyond repair. For all her ambition, she now sat exposed, stripped of both power and dignity. And in that room, under the weight of her own downfall, she was smaller than she had ever dared to imagine. Mark's shoulders shook as he rose halfway from his chair, his voice raw and broken. "Mom, I was wrong." His eyes glistened with the weight of shame. "I never thought it would come to this. I thought she knew what she was doing." The words faltered, collapsing into silence. I looked at him, not with anger, but with the cold clarity of someone who had carried betrayal long enough to name it plainly. "Mistakes are yours to mend," I said, my voice steady, leaving no room for comfort. "Do not let greed guide you again." The words landed heavier than any scolding. He sank back into his chair, hands clutching at his knees as though to keep himself from unraveling. Around him, relatives whispered, their eyes sliding away from the fallen heir who had once been expected to carry the family's name. His reputation lay in tatters, shredded not by rumor but by the evidence laid bare before everyone. In his silence, the truth was merciless. He had lost not only trust, but also the illusion of control. Charlotte could no longer rescue him. Her schemes had collapsed in disgrace. What remained was the mountain of debt he had chosen to ignore, the loans and failures now pressing down without escape. For a moment I felt the ache of motherhood, the memory of a boy who once ran to me for reassurance. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who had bartered his integrity for empty promises. I did not reach for him. Some lessons cannot be softened. Within days, the consequences arrived like storm clouds breaking. The bank issued an official letter warning that Charlotte's forged signature could trigger a full criminal investigation. Her bold attempt to steal what was never hers was no longer just a family scandal. It was a matter for the law. The subtrust designated for Mark came under the strict oversight of the corporate trustee. Every expense was monitored, every withdrawal justified. His reckless freedom was gone, replaced by boundaries that reminded him daily of how much he had squandered. Charlotte's name was nowhere on the paperwork. She had no standing, no influence, no path to touch a cent, even through her husband. The social fallout struck harder. Word spread quickly among relatives and the wider community. Charlotte tried to seize 55 million but was exposed in front of everyone. Friends withdrew, invitations dried up, whispers followed her in every room. Creditors she once kept at bay now came knocking, their patience spent, their demands ruthless. Her carefully curated image online, photos of champagne glasses, luxury handbags, exotic vacations, crumbled under the weight of public scorn. All that remained was infamy. Through it all, I held my ground. As chairwoman of the Family Foundation, I announced its mission to provide scholarships and fund charitable projects. $30 million transformed from contested inheritance into legacy, leaving even the most skeptical relatives stunned. I did not simply preserve wealth, I redirected it toward a future that outlived personal greed. And as trustee over Mark's subtrust, I set terms that were fair yet firm. I would not abandon my son, but neither would I allow him to fall again into ruin. For the first time in weeks, respect, not pity, filled the room when eyes turned to me. Charlotte sat collapsed on the stone steps outside the law office, her face pale as chalk, her hair tangled by the afternoon wind. Gone was the polished smile, the sharpened heels, the aura of triumph she had worn like armor. She looked smaller than ever, her body hunched as though the weight of humiliation pressed her into the ground. I walked past her without pause, my steps steady, the leather case in my hand no longer a burden but a symbol. Relatives followed, their gazes warm with respect, some offering quiet nods as if to acknowledge not only my victory, but the dignity I had reclaimed. Behind me, whispers rose, soft but cutting. They say age is weakness, but today, who is truly weak? That evening, I stood alone on the balcony of my new apartment. The sun melted into the horizon, casting the sky in molten gold. In my hand, a glass of red wine caught the fading light. Beyond the railing stretched the sea, its waves rolling into silence, or perhaps the vast city shimmering into night. For the first time in weeks there was no noise, no performance, only stillness. On my desk inside lay photographs, children smiling as they held scholarships from the Family Foundation. Their joy reminded me that legacy was more than wealth. It was a bridge into the future. I had secured my husband's vision, preserved his name, and turned greed into generosity. Yet the quiet carried its own ache. The bond with my son had cracked, perhaps beyond repair. Victory could not heal every wound. In my heart, a whisper rose, invisible for years, until the last page. But is victory the same as happiness? If this story touched you, remember, age never equals weakness. Guard your dignity, cherish what is true, and never let another's greed define your life. And if within you lies a dream long buried, perhaps today is the moment to wake it.